This is my Walstad Betta tank right now, 30 days after its initial setup, and it doesn't actually have a betta fish in it right now because the nitrite levels are still a little high, but I do want to add one sometime in month 2. For this video, I want to go over how I set this tank up because the Walstad method seems to be getting a lot of interest right now, and the idea of using natural filtration via plants is something that I do want to focus on moving forward. I chose to use an AquaEl shrimp set 30 for this build as it's an 8 US gallon tank or around 30 litres, and it's roughly 11.5 by 11.5 by 13 inches or 29 by 29 by 35 centimetres, making it a decent option for a betta fish. The Walstad method recommends the use of around 1 inch of regular topsoil as the nutrient layer of your substrate, so I started by sieving some topsoil into my tank. Using a sieve isn't essential, but it's surprising how much stuff the sieve will actually catch and prevent from going into your tank, so in my opinion it is worth the effort. I repeated the sieving process over and over until I had around 1 inch of topsoil across the full base plate of the tank to provide nutrients to all of the plants that I want to use. After that, I added 1 inch of fine gravel to the tank to act as a cap and layer to trap the nutrients from the soil and prevent it from leaking into my tank's water column and potentially causing problems with my water parameters. Once I was happy with the substrate layers, I did add some water to the tank until both substrate layers were submerged and I could see gas bubbles being released. This is technically an optional step, but this gas does have to be released from the substrate, and I rather leave the tank overnight in this state for the bubbles to emerge rather than plant it and have the bubbles emerge and potentially release the plants from the substrate or put gravel all over them. Thankfully, the bubbles had stopped by the next morning and the tank was ready to plant, and my new live plant order was delivered a couple of hours later. Due to this method needing so many fast-growing stem plants, I went with Limnophila Sessiliflora, Hygrophila Polysperma and Rotala Rotundifolia to help maintain the water parameters, but I also picked up some Ludwigia Mini Super Red to try and test red plants with the Walstad method. I also picked up some Staurogyne Repens for the mid-ground of the tank and some hairgrass to use in the foreground. My plan is to cover the back half of the tank in stem plants to ensure there's enough natural filtration with fast-growing stem plants, and then split the remaining half of the tank into 2 different quarters, one for the mid-ground and one for the foreground. So I started by adding the Ludwigia Mini Super Red to the back right of the tank and the Limnophila Sessiliflora to the back left. I then added the Hygrophila Polysperma to the back centre of the tank and the Rotala Rotundifolia to the back centre directly in front of the Hygrophila Polysperma, covering around half of the tank. Next, I used 3 tubs of Staurogyne Repens to cover the next 25% of the tank, and this will act as the mid-ground between the foreground and background plants to break things up. Finally, I added some hairgrass to the front 25% of the tank to act as foreground plants, and I am curious if I can get this to carpet in a Walstad setup. Once the plants were in place and I was happy, I added water to the tank and filled it up. I am intentionally avoiding the use of hardscape in this tank as I want to try a strict Walstad tank method, and Diana Walstad does put stipulations on the use of hardscape in this type of tank, so I just decided to leave it out and maximise the plant space. Once the tank was full of water, I added a dechlorinator to the water column to make sure my tap water was as safe as possible. Now that there's water in the tank, I can take some of the excess salvinia from one of my other tanks and add it to this Walstad Betta tank. At this stage, most of the stem plants were limp, but this is totally normal and the gas will build up in the stems and leaves of these plants over the next couple of days, and they'll start to stand up straight and grow towards the tank's light source. The dwarf hairgrass was a bit of a pain to plant in this tank, and it does have random roots sticking up out of the substrate, but for now I'm happy with it. This tank did have a bacteria bloom within hours of the initial setup, with the tank's water column starting to cloud up, but this can be normal and it naturally cleared the following day without me needing to do any water changes. The tank accessory upgrades that I'd ordered were delivered the next day, so I upgraded the tank's heater to a Fluval T50 as it's a far better option than the cheap heater that I was using in the tank. As I won't be using a filter in this tank, I picked up a cheap USB pump to provide some water circulation and move warm water and nutrients around to make sure all the plants are getting what they need. Natural CO2 will be at a premium in this tank as I'm not using any CO2 injection, so I want to keep as much of the natural CO2 in the water column as possible to help with plant growth. That's why I chose this little USB pump, as it's fully submerged and shouldn't cause any surface disturbance, and it will minimise the gas exchange while also having an adjustable water flow that is suitable for betta fish. By day 4, all of the stem plants were in the upright position and grown towards their light source in the tank. The Staurogyne Repens and the hairgrass also seemed fine in the tank and they were starting to grow, and I was happy with how things were going. By day 7, the Salvinia had almost covered the surface of the tank, with its rapid growth rate being due to the large number of free-flow nutrients in the tank's water column. I also did the tank's first water parameter check, and nitrites and nitrates were up a little bit, but ammonia was shown at 0 ppm. By day 10, this white algae or fungus had started to grow in the tank, and I'm really not sure what this is, but it did fade over a day or two. The Hygrophila Polysperma was also close to the surface of the tank, with the rest of the stem plants quickly catching up. Algae was also starting to grow in this tank, but I'm really not worried about algae at this stage, as the shrimp and snail that I'll add later should be enough to deal with it. The Staurogyne Repens and hairgrass were also shown visible signs of growth by this stage, giving me confidence that they will at least grow in this tank setup even if they don't actually carp it. I checked the tank's water parameters again, and the nitrites were still up a little bit, but the ammonia and nitrate levels should be fine like this. I was worried that the Salvinia was covering too much of the surface of the tank and potentially reducing the light penetration, so I decided to remove a lot of it. I also decided that a partial water change is probably a good idea, along with some trimming of the Hygrophila Polysperma. I did consider trimming some of the other stem plants as well, but with the Hygrophila being the only one touching the surface of the water, it was the only one that I clipped. I replanted all of its trimmings back into the substrate of the tank to increase the number of plants in there and help with the natural purification of the tank's water moving forward. Once I was happy, I refilled the tank with clean tap water and added some dechlorinator, and then I let the tank do its thing for a couple of days. By day 16, the Hygrophila Polysperma was starting to turn yellow, and I was worried that it might be a problem with the low-powered stock light on the tank. The stock light's only 520 lumen and 4.8 watts, so I upgraded it to a Hyger 957, with this being a 927 lumen light, which is also 20 watts, so it's a big upgrade. Here's a side-by-side with the stock light on the left and the Hyger on the right. The photograph may not do it justice, but the improvements are definitely noticeable to the eye. On day 23, I did a second round of trimming, but I seem to have lost the video footage, so here's side-by-side photographs. I basically trimmed all of the stem plants in this tank and then replanted most of the trimmings back into the substrate to help increase the plants in here to purify the water moving forward. On day 24, I tested the water parameters again, and the nitrites are ever so slightly up, but this should be fine for a zebra neurite snail, as they are pretty hardy, so I added one to the tank for it to get started on the algae. It really didn't take long for the snail to get to work, and it started to munch on the algae on the tank glass within minutes of me adding it to the tank. On day 25, I was at Horizon Aquatics picking up supplies for a different tank, and I saw this little betta fish that I really wanted. Here's some footage of the other betta fish that they had, but I managed to resist the urge to buy this guy, as I was worried about the nitrite levels being slightly above 0 ppm and potentially causing problems for a fish, as they are not as hardy as snails. I'm not in a rush to get a betta fish for this tank, and I always have plenty of beautiful ones in there when I'm down at Horizon, so once the tank's water parameters are suitable, I will be adding some shrimp and hopefully a betta in month 2.